So again, welcome to Rebels with a Heart. The topic for today is compassionate leadership and how empathy in action is the bridge to building trust and so much more in terms of our shared purpose and human experience. So with that, I'm thrilled to welcome our guests and panelists today. Each of them has a unique lens and a heart that's going to be, I think, shining brightly today. So with that, we're going to welcome Mo. So Mo, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Derek. Really wonderful to be with all of you. I'm excited about this very important conversation. By way of introduction, I came to the US when I was 11. My mom got a job at the World Bank. We came from Egypt. And I was excited to come to this land of opportunity. And it's truly been life-changing. I started out in pre-engineering at the University of Maryland, where I promptly was on academic probation twice. And then I found architecture, and I was on the dean's list. And then I changed to finance because I decided that business was more in line with my future. But my senior year, I took a class in entrepreneurship, and the teacher was the founder of an organization called Entrepreneurs Organization. Actually, at the time, it was called Young Entrepreneurs Organization. And you have to be under 40 and be the founder or owner of a business that does at least $1 million in sales. I was not one of those founders or owners. I was the poor hired schmuck that they had on staff. But as associate director, I absolutely was moved by all these entrepreneurs. And within a year, Vern quit and I became executive director. And while I was there, the number one member benefit was this thing we called Forum, which is a group of roughly 8 people that get together every single month in a confidential, structured environment in order to help each other grow personally, professionally, and to provide one another with a support community. I first attended one of those trainings in 1991, and it blew my mind. It blew my mind because I never found a place where people can be so open and so vulnerable and feel so connected and feel so much empathy. And until that moment, I had never experienced that level of compassion. And maybe that is this part of where I first saw compassionate leadership. And it became my passion. And in 97, I quit my job and made it my business. And in the meantime, I've had the blessing to work with over 25,000 CEOs in this space and underrepresented minorities at Google, Harvard Business School alumni. And it's been a blessing because it's given me an incredible view into humanity. And I mentioned at the beginning, I'm from Egypt, and to see this war waging in the Middle East is truly heartbreaking, particularly because being in this wonderful country and seeing this amazing melting pot, I see how people are people, and it doesn't matter where they're from. And I'm not going to go on with the rest of my list. And it breaks my heart that we can't express deeply enough that message to those that are still polarized and put in these situations. I'll stop there.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for being who you are. So,
thank you.
Natalie, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. And Mo, wow, what a great intro. So, it's your heart up to follow. But I'll jump in and share a little bit about me. If you're hearing an accent, you are correct. I am from the island of Trinidad and Tobago. I am actually calling in now from Miami, Florida. I consider myself an adventurer, and I would say I'm not only a global citizen, but I'm also a travel enthusiast. And I love exploring new places. I love experiencing new cultures. And most of all, I love sharing the universal language of a smile. And that is something that has led me to so many life adventures and adventures that I approach all with an open heart and mind. So that's a little bit about me. I have a consultancy that's called Ion Marketing. Ion Marketing is really a business development, training, coaching, leadership type of consultancy. So I help leaders, actually I inspire leaders because I am the Chief Inspiration Officer. So I inspire leaders to be at their best. But the key thing that I've been doing over the last 2 years really is helping businesses, brands, and professionals to design meaningful connections. My background is in sales and marketing, and I've spent over 25 years propelling clients to the forefront of their own businesses. I facilitate groups and individuals, and I help them to unlock their highest potential. I love energizing ideas. I love meaningful connections. And I also love clients who are ready to reinvent themselves, who are looking at opportunities to transform. We're in an ever-changing world, and so we can't remain the same. Being able to take ourselves forward in a new way, something that is I'm very inspired by. I met Donato Tramuto just over a year ago. Donato was actually delivering the keynote speech, and I was working with my business partner, Tom Johnston, and we were helping to create the keynote experience, which is really taking that keynote and converting it into an opportunity for the audience to participate and engage in the conversation. And right after, Donato said, wow, this was great. We should do some work together. And here we are, exactly a little more than a year into it. And compassionate leadership has been something I've become very passionate about, because in truth, it is a way to transform your business. It is a way to transform your culture. And it is a way to transform who you are and how you show up in the world. So that's a little about me. I'll pass it back to you.
Love your energy and your enthusiasm. And that was an amazing tee up for Donato as well on the compassionate leadership topic that we have at hand today. So thank you for being here as well.
Welcome.
Donato.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Mo. Your story is very touching. And I don't want to talk about me. I would prefer to really share my story. As I've said many times in my travels over the last couple of years in the book that I just released, there is a vulnerability decay going on right now in our world, that we are afraid to share our stories because the words get cherry-picked and we're not listening to understand, we're listening to react. So I hope today, as I share my story, that there will be a real desire to listen to understand how I got to where I am today, and this notion of compassionate leadership. I was 8 years old when I had a middle ear infection that unfortunately rendered me nearly without hearing for about 10 years. I suffered a severe speech impediment, failed the 5th grade. I had a twin brother, bullied. And I mentioned the twin brother because many of my friends poked fun at me and thought that I wouldn't amount to anything. And during the course of my hearing loss, I lost my brother in a car accident, and my sister-in-law, who gets credit for my ability to speak today, she was a speech pathologist. 2 weeks before I was to have my 5th ear surgery, she died in childbirth, giving birth to her 2nd child, and it was a devastating loss for me, and perhaps the reason why I went into healthcare and devoted whatever effort I had to improving the healthcare. But the ultimate of all things changed my life on 9/11, as I think it changed many of our lives. That weekend before, my 2 friends and their 3-year-old were staying with my partner and me at our summer home. And we decided, I had a ticket for that weekend. We decided that we would travel together on September 11th. I woke up on September 10th with a toothache, and I got off of that plan that we were contemplating and saved my life because I went out the night of September 10th, but my 2 friends and their 3-year-old kept their plans and lost their lives on that fateful day on September 11th. Rather than have bitterness or hatred in my heart, I kind of found hope in the words of Robert Kennedy when he said, all of us might wish at times that we lived in a more tranquil world, but we don't. And if our times are difficult and perplexing, so are they challenging and filled with opportunity. And that quote really hit me hard. My partner and I were inspired to launch a foundation And for the last 22 years, rather than be bitter and angry, we have devoted our effort and time to helping to make the world a more compassionate and kinder place. And Mo, I share with you the pain of what's going on in our world today, and the pain that so many people are feeling as we're in Europe and we bump into so many people right now. The pain, the anguish, the lost sense of feeling hope. And yet I think with compassion and kindness, we can bring hope. We can bring a resolution to the problems that are before us. And that's why I wrote this book. I wrote it because I feel that our last best hope is optimism. Our last best hope is to help others be kinder and more compassionate, and to take the time to listen to the stories, because when you listen to the stories, you find commonality. You find that we are more alike than we are different. And so all the other stuff that I've done in my life in terms of achievements in business really don't have much merit in terms of who I am as a person. I hope that the story that I shared with you today gives you an indication of the person who I am and the risks that you take sometimes in sharing the stories. But I rather share my story with full sincerity and authenticity than to be disconnected to other people because I'm not able to relate to them. That's who I am.
Nato, thank you for sharing your story so openly, so vulnerably here with us, as well as this audience. And I'm quite confident that people feel your heart and recognize your resilience and fortitude and what you've been able to cultivate through those challenges, and be an example of hope and how you're doing this in the world. So thank you. And that applies to each of you, right? I know, Mo, I know a bit of your story as well, and the way that you've shown up in this way personally, and really are leading by example. And Natalie, in our short time knowing each other, I know that as well. So before we transition into discussion, again, I'm Derek Lundsten. I'm the privileged host of Rebel with the Heart. I'm also the president of LifeGuides, which is very much aligned with this work of connecting people for the purpose of sharing stories, for healing, for connection, really working through those challenges to foster a healthier individual life and a collective life through business and through our families and our communities. And ultimately, we seek to serve billions of people around the world using this technology platform to connect that and operationalize compassion and empathy in the workplace and beyond. So with that, we'll transition back into this. I'll just say, in this moment in time of the world of business that we live in, about a year ago, and Mo, we were together at an event where we talked about the role of empathy and the role that it plays on mental health and on culture. And there was a real moment, I felt, where there seemed to be a collective consciousness of where compassion is going to fit in to the workplace. And I think over the last 12 months, there's almost been a whiplash of going back to business as it is, where we've seen reductions and focusing on the bottom line. And now we're even seeing the geopolitical construct of our human rawness, of the things that we do when we don't agree, and how we move into those less than better angels of our nature, right? And I think that it's a moment for us as examples to be compassionate leaders, but I think this is that moment where it's really required for us to lean into that, right? So to give some context, we did an episode a few months back on compassion, because we were, LifeGuides was a partner in this organization called Compassion 2.0. Like, we were talking about this, we talked about what is compassion? What is this idea of operationalizing empathy and showing up for people? And even in the last few months, there's just been so much movement of division, distrust, hurt. And I think it's an invitation for us, again, to lean in on this, to be an example, to demonstrate compassion in the workplace, in our environments, in our communities, amidst what could be perceived as outward. We know this is an inner work that it transcends and is shared with others. So I'd love for any one of you to kind of riff on that. I wouldn't say it's so much a question, but just because I know that each of you has such a unique point of view on this topic, I think that might be a nice place to start. And then I'll go into some specific questions too. Any one of you can take that.
I'm happy to go first. The challenge that we've had for many years in the workforce, and I'd be interested to hear Mo and Natalie's commentary, is that we have defined the language of business by numbers. And I really think that the And this is why I titled my book, The Double Bottom Line. I don't want to dismiss numbers, yet at the same time, there is a need, there is a thirst for a kinder, gentler, for love in the workplace. And I don't know why we're so afraid to say it. Let's just call it right out. I think we want love in the workplace. You know, we have love in our friendships, we have love in our families. And for years, I, was told by my fellow leaders as a CEO of a public company and CEO of other companies, I was basically told by my fellow CEO colleagues that compassionate leadership is weak leadership, Donato. You don't want to use that term. And I would just kind of shake my head. And I really couldn't understand what they were saying. And when we look at the workforce today, the average age of the CEO is 59 years old. By the way, that's the average age of the elected officials in Washington. Now, those individuals were trained by business professors in the 60s and 70s, yet when you look at the composition of the workforce today, the Gen Zers and the millennials, it is inching towards 30, 40, 50% of the entire workforce are from a generation that's looking for something different. And they're not looking for the language in the business to be just about numbers. And I think the sooner we can help leaders understand the notion that we're not saying it's one or the other, what we are saying is that we really need to share who we are, to share it in a way that really grabs the workers. For many, many years, I'm going to be very upfront with all of you. You know, I am a gay man. I never shared that with any of my employees. Until 2014, I was receiving the Robert F. Kennedy Ripple of Hope Award, and I was walking up the stage, and I wasn't going to mention my partner. And I said to myself, shame on you. You're about ready to receive a Human Rights Award, and you are going to walk up on stage in front of, I had about 400 or 500 of our associates in the audience. And I opened up and I shared first about who I was, and I shared my partner. And afterwards, about 20 employees ran up to me and they said, thank you for doing that. You're less boring. You know, we think that it matters to us. Yet when you are open and when you share who you are, you allow other people to feel comfortable that they can share who they are. And so this is more prevalent today. And I like to hear from Mo and Natalie. I think today, after the pandemic, something has changed, but it was changing before the pandemic, but something has changed in the whole mentality of what people are looking for. And I think data and numbers will get you so far. Emotions and love will get you all the way. And I think we have got to bring love and we've got to bring kindness into the workforce.
Yes.
I love that. I love that. And I want to just jump in and just draw on what you've shared, Donato. You know, you mentioned that, you know, the average age of our CEOs today is about 59 years old. Yet we have such a high percentage of young people, folks who are in their 20s, 30s, and, you know, even early 40s in our workforce. And, you know, we ask ourselves, what is the big problem that exists right now? What are people struggling with? And there are two things that I see quite often with my own clients, and I see in interactions that I have often. And that's communication is one, and two is a sense of belonging. And, you know, when we think about it, Christopher Lockhead refers to the world made up of two groups of people, the native analog and the native digital. And the native analog means that you came into this world and this device was not the first thing that you had or played with or you want to do anything with. But for our native digital, this is the primary source of communication. And so we have two separate worlds and two separate ways of being. And we don't have a common understanding as to how to bridge that gap. And so when we think of healthy organizations, so when we think of the new world of work, we should be asking ourselves, what is required to create greater communication? What is required to create better collaboration? How can we create a space of belonging and understanding? And the first step is really to open our hearts and to have compassion, to listen, to understand, to tune in to what's different, and maybe how those differences can help yield a whole new future.
Yeah.
Because, you know, the small group of people leading are not going to be there forever.
Mm-hmm.
How are we mentoring our leaders of the future? How are we connecting with them? And how are we handing the world over? And those are important questions that I think, you know, we have to address. And compassion is a way to begin to have the conversations.
Well said, Natalie. I'm going to come back to a key topic of that in just a moment. But Mo, I want to come to you and your thoughts on this. Kind of
first, I just love hearing from both of you. And Donato, thank you for your vulnerability even here with us. And it is just a great example. There's a professor that I love from Stanford, David Bradford, and he says vulnerability is the currency of relationships, and that without vulnerability, relationships remain superficial. And I say that as often as I get a chance to, because sadly, I think a lot of people think of vulnerability as weakness or as showing that they're not perfect. And that's maybe a different kind of programming from the digital and analog, but it's how we were brought up. Many of us don't show your emotions, don't cry, you know, that kind of stuff. And what I've noticed is in order for there to be vulnerability, first we must create a safe space for people to be vulnerable with some very specific guidelines. You know, for example, do we have confidentiality? Don't we have confidentiality? And the second guideline that's critical is not judging. And, you know, too often we are judgmental or we generalize without an awareness of how that lands on other people. And too often we give advice just because somebody asked for it. And even that can be heard as a judgment with all good intent to be helpful. So one thing that, you know, we've embedded in all the peer group work that we've done for decades is this notion of speaking from experience and not giving advice. And what is interesting about that, just to make the point, to link it back to my original opening, is in that environment, you get to see people for who they are, back to the theme that we're talking about here. And when you see somebody for who they are, you get to know the human being, not the surface. And I'll give you one example of why that matters. You know, one of my forum mates lost his mother. And this guy happens to be Jewish. We have all denominations in our peer group. We've been together since 1991. And I flew up to New York because we haven't missed a funeral of any of our members. And members, family members, of course, not members themselves. And I see him outside the funeral home, and he gets out of his limo. He comes over, he hugs me, and he breaks down. And we're both sobbing in each other's arms. And he says to me, I just now felt safe to cry. Here he has been with his family for, 24 hours. But what we established in this group enabled that kind of a meaningful connection. And here he is, Jewish guy. I'm from Egypt. And none of that stuff matters when you know each other authentically.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful story.
So one question I'll kind of pose out there before I go back to the topic that Natalie raised is, how do we, to your comment, Donato, from a standpoint of we do operate in a numbers-based business, right? We all have the opportunity of having been leaders or are leaders and lead teams. But how do practically speaking leaders cultivate this practice where, to your point, Mo, we can create this level of safety and openness and vulnerability in the organization? Because I think the biggest barrier, frankly, is just the speed of which we're constantly doing and doing and doing. that we don't even give the moment to really allow the space to even have the emotions. But one thing I'll just kind of comment on, even in this particular meeting, there's a real presence, there's a real spaciousness in this group that I feel that you often don't have in business meetings. Like, this feels like we have an abundance of time right now, even though I know we don't, it's limited, but it feels like we do. But on a lot of Zooms, it is moving, it's kinetic, right? And that's the way that the business world operates right now. In many ways, driven by what you talked about, Natalie, about digital natives, and we're going to come back to that in just a moment. But how do we foster more of that opportunity in the day-to-day work experience for people to really share that openness, that vulnerability, and to create that deeper relationship movement beyond a business outcome? And how does compassionate leadership play a role in that?
I think in several ways. I think that I think first you have to show yourself compassion. And I think that it's very interesting in the 41 contributors that that we interviewed for the book. These are global, these are global leaders. Before I interviewed them, I had sent them a number of standard questions, but I surprised each one with the question of, how do you show yourself compassion? And without exception, you're welcome to look at all the videotaping. Each leader stumbled over that question. And so I think we have to show ourselves compassion. We live now in a world where it appears to be wrong and appears to be incorrect if you as a leader take time for yourself. You know, I think it was Socrates who said, you know, the unexamined life is not worth living. And when I go to bed at night, I reflect on my day. I reflect on what I could have done better. I reflect on what I did well, because not all is bad in a given day. And I think when you take the time to realize that you're not bad, that your story matters, then I think you promote more of that same style in the organization. In my book, I talk about the Aristotle experiment at Google. Google had categorized that if you hire the best people, you have the best teams. And they had done a survey because they were not getting the kind of productivity that they wanted in the company. They did a survey of their top leaders, and one leader in particular had been deemed very negatively by his staff as not a caring and giving person. And so at the next staff meeting, he opened up the staff meeting with one question. He said, I'm going to do something today that I've never done before. Tell me something about yourself that we don't know, and I will go first. And he went first, and he said, I am ill with cancer. I have stage 3, stage 4 cancer. I can't remember exactly his stage, but everyone in his team were shocked. They knew nothing about what this individual was experiencing. And then somebody else opened up, and by the time they got through the 15, 16, whatever number of staff members, the team had felt like they were a part of a team. Fast forward 6-8 months later, they resurveyed the group, and that team had by far the most sense of connectivity. Now, in our survey, we found that 80% of the leaders felt that they were practicing compassion. But when we surveyed the 1,500 employees in our qualitative research, 59% of the employees felt that compassion was actually being employed in the workforce. So there is a gap, Derek. And I think the gap has to begin with us acknowledging and recognizing that there are still barriers that exist in the organization as senior leaders to talk about compassion. Yet, I don't know, Mo and Natalie, if you feel this way, I can't pick up a book or a newspaper today or an article that doesn't mention something about compassion. And so, Mo, I don't know if you're aware of this, but we had applied for National Compassionate Leadership Week to the National Day calendar, and we were given it. The second week of September now is National Compassionate Leadership Week. And the only reason why I bring that up is that it tells me that this is an important movement that's taking place. And so I think today, the fact that we are acknowledging it, we should feel first comfortable in taking the time to rebuild our sense of energy and recharge our batteries, which is showing your self-compassion, and then be willing to take that compassionate feeling into the workforce.
Well said.
Well said. Well said.
I see Tracy has mentioned here in the chat that this conversation is filling her cup. And I want to share, Tracy, I suspect that it's filling a lot of cups. Because as you just mentioned, Donato, we are seeing the word compassion emerging in so many spaces and in so many ways, which means that we are crying out for more compassion. We're crying out for it. What we may not have yet achieved is a way to implement, to operationalize, and to activate that compassion. And you said something really important. You said, maybe it starts with self-compassion. And it absolutely does, because are we, and I would ask myself this question, am I slowing down enough? And the truth is, sometimes I'm not. And if we stop to ask ourselves, pause to check in with how are we being compassionate about ourselves and our deadlines with the world, with all the things that the demands of the family and the job and the clients and everything that's happening. Where are we pausing? And I ask myself sometimes every day, okay, when am I going to pause? I sometimes put it off for tomorrow. I'll pause tomorrow. But the truth is, we should pause every day, because in that pause, we're able to see, we're able to hear, and we're able to feel others. We're able to stop and maybe ask a question. How was your day? What was your biggest win for today? What made you feel good? We're able to actually connect and create an authentic conversation and a meaningful conversation that you never know. It can truly change someone's life because you get to see other people. It's almost like we're walking around with our heads down, but our heads are up, but our eyes are closed. We're not seeing each other, and so we're not connecting, and so we're not able to share that vulnerable exchange that allows that bond to be established. And to your point, the vulnerability decay, it happens also too because we're connecting just online, and everyone's putting a bunch of stuff on social media or on their profile, and we know if it's real or if it's not real, and if you put something, you get attacked. It's a whirlwind of activity.
So I want to come back to that. That's kind of along the lines of where I was going to go with that previous question or comment from earlier, Natalie. And Mo, will come back to your thoughts on all of this, which is, with the digital natives and social media in particular, right? We are online. We are distracted. It's easier when we're in person. It's easier when we're in front of peers, even in this format, to see another, to deepen that connection, to ask those questions, to be authentic, to be vulnerable, to invite vulnerability. And yet, especially to your point, on that younger generation, the people that have grown up with this, their first device, my kids know how to do things on this phone without ever learning how to do it, right? And yet, we're now conditioned. We're on social media hours of the day. We're interacting with people without an emotional or relational connection, period. And the beauty is we have immediacy of information, right? To the point of we can view literal videos of what's happening right now in the Middle East, around the world. We're able to see, as if we're there physically, what's going on the ground, and we can see information in an instant that would never have happened even 10 years ago. And yet, even with the proximity and the access that we have, in some ways, it desensitizes us, one, but also it allows us to actually detach from communicating with one another. It's all about shit. It's all about, what do I think? What do I want to say? It amplifies everyone's voice, but it has very little to do with actually listening. And it's designed to be quick, hit, as opposed to actually examining, to your comment, what is being said, what are the facts, what's happening here, where's the shared humanity, what are we all connecting on? I think that is a real challenge that we have right now as leaders, not just in our businesses, but in our families and our communities. That's a force that is being reconciled right now, that it's both a blessing that we have that information and access and connectivity, and yet it's somehow disconnecting us from our hearts, from each other, from that shared meaning. And so how do we, especially with that young generation that just knows that, how do we work with that in this context? And maybe, Mo, I'll let you start with that, since we kind of transition. I'd love to get your thoughts on this first. But I see everyone nodding. Like there's a lot of yes.
There's a lot to say, and there's an interesting comment here by John Lovett. I wonder where sense of common purpose fits in with compassion. But I want to go back to your first point first, which was how do we make this change? And in our case, it always starts with the CEO. If the CEO is not willing to be vulnerable, if the CEO is not willing to lean into this space of saying, "Hey, I'm not perfect," then there's a trickle down effect. And it requires real vulnerability to say, "Hey, I don't know how to do this. Like whatever this task is, I'm lost." But if you don't say, "I don't know how to do this," what are the consequences? I think they're even more grave. And so with us, it's always the CEO being what I call an enlightened CEO, saying, "I think it's important for us to take care of our people, to make sure they have meaningful relationships, to make sure they have connections, because most people spend more time at work than they do at home when they're awake. And if we aren't making the most of that time, then it's just a transaction. And as a transaction, I could work anywhere from anywhere. I mean, in this day and age, I don't even have to go to the office anymore. And so what's drawing people to the WEN? They better like the people they work with. Yep. So back to the comment in the chat and the Q&A, one of the comments, one of the points in my book is about shared purpose as one of the tools to build meaningful relationships. If we have a shared purpose, we're much more likely to be aligned, and it is just one other facet of having that commonality. Not the only one in our experience, obviously, but it's certainly an important one.
Yeah, I like to just, if I may add to that, Mo has said several things that I don't want lost here today. And I think that you mentioned about creating space, and it's got to be a safe space. And I think that much of what I heard here today is a line that I've used in my own book, and we are listening to react. We're not listening to understand. And I'll give you a great case example, not to, play with politics here, but a number of months ago, President Biden had indicated that his son had died. He knew what it was to lose somebody in Iraq. His son had died in Iraq. And all of a sudden, people reacted to that he lied. And if you get to understand what he was saying, I understood what he was saying. His son served in Iraq. His son came back, had a, brain tumor and died. But we are so full of critiques today. If we just took the time to understand the stories of other people, and that's what I think a CEO needs to promote is story sharing. Do you really know everything about the individual in your organization? I always give the great case example when I was CEO of the publicly traded company Tivity Health. I got on an elevator one day. By the way, they had an elevator devoted only to the CEO, which I refused to take. And I took the elevator that the associates, took. And it was 6:30 in the morning. And there was an employee who got on with me. And, I never asked the question, "Hi, how are you?" I always ask the question, "Tell me about what your morning is like." And all of a sudden, this employee broke down. His family had been in Iraq, and he lost his family, most of his family, the day before as a result of a bombing. And he was distraught. He did not have the resources to send to his family who were, survivors. We immediately brought him to our office. We understood his plight, and we immediately did something. That's compassionate leadership. Compassionate leadership, you mentioned in the beginning, Derek, it's empathy in action. It's no longer good enough for a leader to say, "Oh, I feel your pain."
Yeah.
You must do something. You must take action. And I think there are too many leaders out there today who default to feeling good about having felt the pain, but they miss the mark in doing something. And I think that's what
next step
has to change. That's what I think has to change in organizations. And when you ask, how do we move this forward? It's not going to be easy. I would be absolutely naive if I felt that we could change this overnight.
Yeah.
But it's not a reason for us to abdicate from the movement.
Yes.
It's not a reason in itself to say, we can't resolve, world hunger. We can't resolve loneliness, which is now the new chronic condition of the 21st century. Here we have technology and all the devices that can connect people, but we are living with the greatest epidemic of all times, and it's called loneliness and social isolation. Yet it is so easy to correct. When we're in an elevator, why do we look away from somebody? Why can't we start a conversation? When we're on the street, what I do is I smile. And my gosh, it's amazing how many people will smile back. Why not check with your elderly neighbor in the neighborhood? That's compassion. Check with the neighbor about if they're living alone. Maybe the only person they're going to see today is the person delivering the mail. Why not bring? So there are simple ways that we ourselves can begin to push forward this notion for a more empathetic in action leadership style.
So that's a great transition. I'd love for you, Natalie, to share the vision behind the Compassionate Leadership Summit that you have upcoming, right? And where I know this is the initial one. I'd like to hear what the long-term vision and view of this work is. Obviously, Mo and I are kindred spirits in this respect, and we have a whole tribe of people who are part of the Rebels of the Heart community that are aligned with this. So I'd love to understand, to your point, how this continues to be nurtured, and not just that, but also Compassionate Leadership Week or Compassionate Week, Compassion Week. That's part of this bigger vision as well. So I'd love to hear a bit about that. Again, putting these beliefs, these principles into action, and cultivating that in our both our communities and our business. And again, for context, this is not promotional. This is purely informational. I'm not affiliated with this. This is a question genuinely on how we do this work together.
Thank you, Derek. And with that in mind, I would actually love to share the long-term vision. Or not even say, I would dare say it's a short-term vision as well, is to create a compassionate leadership movement. We want to onboard more compassionate ambassadors. And so how do we create a space where we can have a meaningful conversation, where we can listen to others who are activating compassion in their own worlds and doing a really good job at it, whether it's self-compassion, whether it's leading a nonprofit or a for-profit, what are they doing in their own spaces to activate compassion in a real way, to change cultures, to change their organizations, and change the way they show up and influence in the world. And I share that, with the lens of, we all influence. We can't not influence the spaces we're in. We're always influencing. What we don't recognize is we each have a choice as to how we can influence. And so we can choose to be more attentive, to listen actively. We can choose compassion. We can choose to bring that in. And in this Compassion Leadership Summit, which we're having on November 2nd and 3rd, we're inviting people into a conversation around compassion and activating compassion in your own world. And I would love to invite everyone here. As a matter of fact, I would like to even share that we took a decision, Donato, Tom, and myself, who are putting on this summit. Given what's happening in the world today, given the pain that we're seeing, how can we use this summit to create more purposeful action? And so we're opening it up as a complementary summit. And we took that decision, basically between yesterday and today, recognizing the need for us to all imbue compassion in our hearts, to create that greater sense of shared purpose, and to have a conversation that matters.
Amazing. Thank you, Natalie. And for the audience in the chat, we will share the link to that summit as well as around the books that have been authored by our guest panelists here for everyone, just in the follow-up. Mo, as you hear kind of this vision and the thought that is going into Donato and Natalie, what's coming up for you, back to the point that you worked with so many executives and entrepreneurs and leaders in your career? You're on the forefront of these relationships. What's kind of popping for you?
I actually think the pandemic has done us a favor.
Yes.
And right, I see nods all around. So, the pandemic did a couple of things. It did a lot of things. But one, it was the first time in my recollection on this planet where everybody was suffering. Everybody. We knew everybody was suffering. And that created a bridge for a conversation. But the backlog of that suffering from which we have yet to come out is people more so than ever value relationships and connection. And I'm seeing a higher demand for our services than ever before. And I think the pandemic, in that sense, awakened us to a need that we might have forgotten. I'll stop there and let my esteemed panelists chime in, because I see them nodding and giving thumbs up.
What Mo just said is really music to my hearing aids, because I really do think, Mo, you're correct. What happened for the first time, perhaps in many generations, we had a common denominator, and we all lost something. It's very interesting. The New York Times about a year ago had stated that perhaps we're measuring the wrong metric from the pandemic. We've been measuring, how many deaths, and they said that might be the wrong metric. Perhaps what we should be measuring is how many lost years, because each person lost something. I may have lost the ability to, go to my nephew's graduation or have a graduation party. Somebody else lost their grandmother and couldn't go to the funeral. At that time, the lost number of years, and there was just the US, was at 6 million lost years. Now, that number must be now astronomical. But my point is, Mo is correct that perhaps the pandemic did something in many respects that was good. However, Mo, I'd be interested to ask you it's almost like 9/11. When I came back from Los Angeles on September 15th, a day that I will always remember, when I was at the airport in Boston, I was met with nearly 100 people. United Airlines knew what had happened to me. And so if you remember, the airspace had been closed that week. And I just so much wanted to get back to be with my partner, and I could not. And I was at my friend's home planning, memorial services and everything else. But when I arrived in Boston on Saturday, September 15th, 100 people greeted me. They didn't care what religion I practiced. They didn't care whether I was gay or straight. They didn't care whether I was white or black. What we had was a common denominator and a sense of compassion. And then we went into the pandemic and we had the same notion. And what I am fearful of, do we need international or national tragedies to bring us back together? How do we bring this sense of compassion that we had in almost every significant tragedy that we've endured in our lifetime? We've come together. How do we do this now without a sense of tragedy? And that's the thing that I'm always struck with. Why can't we just practice basic humanity and compassion without having to have a tragedy take place? And I pose that to my wonderful panelist, Mo, in terms of your insights on that.
I just was having a conversation with my next panelist on my next podcast episode at the Heart of Business. And it's the president of Gap International, Bob Rothman. And he is convinced that you don't need a tragedy to make a big change. And I welcome his view, because I think you're more likely to make a big change if there is a tragedy, because you have no choice. And so I think it's an interesting intellectual question to debate. I don't know the science behind it. I know that the big changes in my life came because of pain. That's what propelled me. In fact, a quote that I just read about Walter Isaacson in his biography of Elon Musk. Walter Isaacson is asked this question, and he says, the job of a biographer is to find out what demons propel a man to create rockets that go to Mars. So I just think there's something about a correlation between our great pains and the good that we do with those pains. If we are able to overcome them. Obviously, some people are not able to overcome them, but in the world that I know, people do overcome those pains, and the bigger the pains, the bigger the successes.
Well, and the way that you overcome those pains, in my experience, and through all of our shared work, is through those relationships, right? That format, the forum that you mentioned, those connections, whoever they may be with, is a key part of working through that, and then cultivating the skills, the tools, the mental framework, emotional framework to do that. No, right? I mean, I think that's a key part of it. And I was fortunate to hear Bob speak on this topic as well at the last Visionary Summit.
Yeah,
and I agree, and I think it was fascinating because I do agree that there should be theoretically a way to accomplish this kind of higher vibration of humanity without the pain, although that will continue to spur further levels of expansion in the work that we're doing. But I think that there's way better ways to accomplish this without that pain. It's not necessary per se. It's functional, it plays a role, and evolutionarily it is playing a role. But we're at a point now as a species, I believe, where we have enough awareness of the contrast, and more people are waking up or awoken to the fact that they don't necessarily need the pain to push. They can allow that ground in, right, without having that crisis. And I think that's part of the work that we're teaching. Like, we're all here as teachers, examples, I believe. So
I hope so. Because the alternative is I'm doing it because I have no choice.
Right.
We always have a choice. And if you think about it, we have the choice to turn that pain into purpose.
Yes.
We have the choice, even if we're not experiencing pain. And I dare say most of us in the world right now are experiencing some type of pain.
Of course.
Even if we claim we're not experiencing any pain, we can empathize with those who are. And then we have the choice to take action. And so we always have a choice. How do we turn that pain into purpose? And I think that's a space where we need to examine, what can we do to make a difference?
Well, I think for those who are listening here today, I think, Derek, one suggestion that I would just say is that it's amazing. We have created a lost sense of relevancy for people who are living on this planet because we're not listening to fully understand their stories. And perhaps a takeaway, I always feel we should have some takeaway when we have these types of podcasts, is today when you're walking home and you might be walking your dog and you're bumping into a stranger, you'd be surprised if you move beyond, hi, how are you, to tell me about your story. Tell me about something interesting that happened in your day today. You'll be amazed at how somebody will open up. And that is the compassionate movement that I think we all can practice. And I'm with you, Mo. I like to think that we are doing this because we have the belief, and I think that I have great hope. I am a firm believer in Robert Kennedy's quote that I shared with you, that, opportunities do exist amidst the challenges that are in front of us. And I think, it's funny, at the end of the book, I talk about the 21% rule, and it throws a lot of people off because they ask me, why 21%? What did you choose that for? And I basically break it down that the 2 and the 1 stands for it begins with you. Do you really believe in this notion of compassion? And if you do, start showing yourself compassion. And the 2 stands for bring somebody else in. And before you know it, the other person you bring in will practice it as well. They'll begin to show themselves compassion, and they will begin to bring somebody else in. That's how these movements start. And it's similar to the 3.5% rule. I'm sure many of you have heard it, the 3.5% rule. You don't need to create violence to really push an agenda forward. You just need 3.5% of the population to come on board with you, and to do it in a very peaceful manner. And I am really honored. I know we're approaching the time, but Mo, I don't know where you have been all my life. It's a pleasure really to have had this amazing, hour with you, and you could sense and feel your authentic self and your commitment to doing good. And I just thank you for what you're doing to move this forward. And it's just really an honor and a pleasure to have spent this quality time. I feel like I won the lottery today.
Oh, well, I'm honored to be with all three of you. And Donato, thank you so much. And Derek, thank you for this opportunity. And Natalie, positive. I thought I had positive energy. This woman is nonstop positive energy. It's incredible.
Oh, it's been a joy to share with you and to share with the audience. And these are conversations that matter. And these are conversations that actually can create a difference. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to each of you. Thank you to all of our audience today for joining us, for sharing your heart, for sharing your time, for sharing your work. Welcome officially to our panelists as rebels with a heart in the community. And I'll just close with a mirror of what you said, Donato, for 1 second. When you ask, how are you, right? You actually give people the option to answer that question authentically and vulnerably to give them the space, right? So often we use that as a formality as opposed to actually allowing someone to express how they are, right? And that's one of those moments, again, where allowing that space and presence gives them that opportunity to create that. So I just would share that with everyone. And thank you for the work that you're doing in the world, and grateful for the time.
Well, and thank you, Derek. Thank you and what you all are doing to really bring people together is very, very inspirational. You have said a lot of great things here today that I think is going to resonate with our own movement. I do want to remind everyone that we made this decision today because of our understanding that compassionate leadership is empathy in action. And rather than have a paid summit, we decided to have a summit that's open to everyone who can bring their own thoughts and insights, as well as their sense of pain in terms of what's going on in the world. So I hope that people will take advantage of this opportunity to come together.
Beautiful.
What's that?
Till next time, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all. Such a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.